Following his assassination attempt on Queen Elsa, Hans had much time to reflect on his actions during his long boat ride back to the Southern Isles. He struggled to get himself into a more seated position, not that he would find a way to be comfortable while bound in rope. To think I was that close, Hans thought to himself. Perhaps I should have laid Anna to rest before going after the Queen. Hans sighed and rolled his eyes as he leaned his head back against the wall of the damp cabin. What am I going to tell Father? The journey back to the Southern Isles lasted a little over a day, and by the time Hans had been tossed off of the ship and onto the dock, you'd think he would have been happy to be on land. But Hans had an idea of what was waiting for him the second that he was brought in front of his father and brothers. Had he been able to come back with news that the kingdom of Arendelle was to be under his control, he might have been able to walk in with his head held high, but to be brought back to his own lands as a prisoner, he could not have felt lower. As the guard walked Hans through the kingdom and towards the castle, he made sure to keep his eyes forward as to stay away from the glaring eyes of the public. While most of the 18 islands that make up the Southern Isles are full of normal townsfolk and lower class, the Isle of Leso was a different story. Being the island containing the kingdom and the capital city, it was mostly full of upper class and nobility, and those are the people who tended to judge failure the harshest. However, by the time that Hans had made it into the main hall of the castle, he had wished that judgment from the public was the only judgment that he faced, for he knew his father was capable of much more than just spiteful glares and stares. Hans was pushed forward by the guard, and at the sight of the throne, he fell to his knees. King George of the Southern Isles sat beside his queen, Alwyn. He stood up straight, with his scowling eyes tearing into his youngest son, who knelt before him. As Hans slowly lifted his head, his eyes met his father's, and he quickly looked back to the cracked stone floor. He caught a good enough glimpse to tell that his brothers were standing in typical formation, from oldest to youngest, left to right, 6 on the king's side and 6 on the queen's. "Speak," King George demanded, his voice cutting through Hans like Kristoff cuts through ice. Hans hesitated. The king leaned forward in his throne. "I won't ask you twice, boy." "Father." Hans stopped himself and looked up to the king, whose eyes had widened at the title. Hans cleared his throat. "My king, Arendelle should be mine. I underestimated the..." The king lifted his hand, silencing his son. "I asked you to come back with one thing, news that our rule would soon extend to the shores of Arendelle," King George began to say, with the volume of his voice quickly rising. "And instead you dare to bring me excuses." Hans dropped his head low in a bow. "I'm sorry, my lord. You have to understand. Queen Elsa, she isn't like the rest of us. She can conjure the winters. Yes, I've heard." The king looked to his son standing to his left and right, and then back to the one on the floor before him. "It's something we're going to have to consider. But in the meantime, we have to deal with your crimes." "Crimes? What do you mean crimes?" Hans questioned. 5 of Hans's elder brothers began to laugh among themselves. "You dare to question your king?" King George yelled as he stood. "You are an embarrassment to our lineage, and you have made it so we must apologize and appease the Queen of Arendelle before she begins to question our loyalty. Do you understand that, boy? You have made me, the great king of the Southern Isle, bow and yield to a queen who is no older than you are." Hans knew better than to say anything that time. "You will spend your days and your nights in the stables, living and eating among the animals. And it's there you will remain until I've figured out what to do with you, or until you've learned your proper place as my livestock." King George sat back in his throne and flicked his wrist. Before Hans could respond in any way, he was being lifted to his feet by the guard and ushered to the stables. He didn't put up any resistance. He knew there would be no point in trying to fight it. And as far as punishments went, he knew that this was nothing compared to the torment his brothers used to put him through. The guards made sure that Hans made it to the stable with the other livestock, and once they were there, they pushed him over the fence. One of the guards smirked and began to chuckle to himself. "Looks like you've missed feeding time, Hans," he said as he pointed over to the food trough that the sheep and pigs had just finished eating out of. "All that's left is the gruel on the bottom." At that point, the other 3 guards joined in on the laughter as they all turned to walk away. "Get some sleep, boy. You have a lot of work to do tomorrow," yelled the guard as he walked back into the castle. Hans began to look around, hoping he might find a portion of the floor that wasn't covered in dirt, mud, or worse. There was no such luck, so he began to turn his attention toward the hay and straw that had all been stacked up in the corners. By no means were they clean or free of bugs, but it was better than lying in manure. Hans grabbed armfuls of the hay and began fashioning a makeshift mattress for himself in the corner, as far away from the sheep and pigs as he could, though that didn't help him with the rancid smell at all. As soon as his bed was set up, Hans grumbled to himself and began to lay down, hoping that he could find some way to sleep. But as the hours pressed on, he found no way of being comfortable, and now the cold had begun to set in. Finally, after hours of struggling, Hans felt his eyes finally begin to grow heavy, and he managed to drift into a brief slumber. One that was ended only a few minutes after it started, as one of the night guards poked his head into the stables. "You still here, Hans?" he chuckled. Hans rolled to answer, but by the time he opened his eyes, the guard had already begun walking back to continue his patrols. Hans struggled again to find sleep, but eventually it found him, and he managed to get about 3 hours of sleep before being startled awake by ice-cold water. Hans' eyes shot open and he looked down at his drenched clothes. Immediately he could hear the laughter of 3 of his older brothers. "Come now, that was unnecessary," Lars, the only sibling of Hans to ever show him any compassion, said. "Let's let Hans get up and get to his chores." "Yeah, clean the stable, rat," spat one of Hans's brothers as the 4 of them turned to walk away. Hans sighed. "Curses," he thought to himself as he slowly stood to his feet. Hans looked around in an attempt to figure out where he should start. The stable was a literal pigsty. Where do you start cleaning? He decided that the first thing to take care of would be all the manure that was lying around. So Hans picked up a shovel and got to work. Over the course of the morning, Hans found himself slipping and landing in the animal droppings on more than one occasion. Each time he would curse either Arendelle or Elsa, each time louder and louder. A couple hours had passed, and by this point Hans, who hadn't had a proper meal in what felt like days, was about to collapse. That was when he heard the sound of servants coming over to the stables. He could hear their buckets and pails hitting together as they walked, and before one of them even said it, Hans knew it was feeding time. He watched as the servants poured the buckets of grain and slop into the trough for the animals, the entire time hoping they might have something for him. And one of them noticed his empty stare, so they had to tell him, "I'm sorry, sir, but we were told that you're to eat with the animals now." And they pointed to the food trough. Hans reluctantly attempted his best to put something in his stomach, as gross as it was. And he did manage to get down a few small bites. That was before he threw it back up after his mind fully processed what he had tried to eat. His stomach needed food, but his brain wouldn't let him stomach it. And in no time, he was out of options. The pigs and sheep devoured the food as fast as it was placed before them. Hans did his best to recover from his sickness and continued trudging away at his daily duties. "I can't believe that this is my life now," he thought to himself. "Curse that evil witch. Curse that entire kingdom." The rest of the day passed slowly, but eventually darkness rolled in, and that meant it was time for Hans to, once again, attempt to fall asleep on his dirty hay pile. It seemed like sleep was going to come easier that night, as his eyes grew heavy as soon as he lay down. Just as Hans was on the cusp of falling asleep, a voice from the darkness startled him awake. "Hans, where are you?" it whispered, and it wasn't long before Hans realized who was trying to get his attention. "Lars?" he asked. "Where are you?" Hans' brother Lars made his way into the stable where he could clearly see his brother sitting in the corner, seemingly dazed. "Sorry, I didn't mean to wake you, little brother, but I saw you get sick earlier and figured you might want something to fill your stomach." Lars extended his hand, which held something that was wrapped in cloth. "It's not much, but it should be better than anything you've had so far." Hans looked up at his brother. "Lars is always the one to come through for me," he thought to himself. He quickly grabbed the wrapped parcel from his brother and tore into it, revealing a small loaf of bread, along with some fruit from dinner. The sight of the food made his stomach begin to growl. "Thank you, Lars." Lars leaned against the wall as his brother began to bite into the food he had sneaked out for him and chuckled. "How do you always seem to find yourself in messes like this one?" he asked jokingly. Hans glared up at his laughing brother, though he didn't stop eating for a second, and with a full mouth he spat, "It was that cursed witch." Lars lowered himself to Hans's level, making sure to keep his clothes clean while doing it. "What happened in Arendelle, Hans? I mean, I've heard the stories, but what really happened?" Hans took a second to finish the food that his brother had graciously procured him. "It was all going as I planned it," he paused. "Better, actually. I had Princess Anna eating out of the palm of my hand. She was kind, sweet, and easy to control. She was someone I could see running my kingdom with." Hans slumped back into the hay pile behind him. But then her sister had to get involved. "The Queen?" Lars asked, and before he could say anything else, Hans cut him off. "The witch?" Hans said with spite on his tongue. "Cursed Queen Elsa. I gave her no reason to doubt me, yet she still wouldn't give me a second thought as a suitor for her sister. Anna even vouched for me, and that was when she summoned the ice. In a single motion, it was like she had brought winter to Arendelle." Lars was speechless. And then it all became about her. There was no swaying Princess Anna away from trying to go after and save her sister. Hans began to clench his fist. "We could have had everything together, a kingdom, loyal subjects." Hans met Lars' stare and looked him close in the eye. "Respect." "You will have respect, Hans. You just have to get it the right way," Lars said after giving his brother a moment to breathe. Hans was quick to respond. "I will have it. It will be mine the second that Arendelle is." Hans stood to his feet and began getting louder at this point. "Mark my words, brother. I will have my vengeance on the Ice Queen, and I will rule Arendelle." Lars stood up straight. "And if the Queen's precious sister Anna won't submit, then she will meet the same fate as Elsa." Before Lars could say anything, the night guard could be heard approaching. He looked at his younger brother and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You'll get through this, Hans." Hans hung his head in shame. "How?" "Just focus on one thing, making it through tonight," Lars said, which caused Hans to look at him, "and then do the same tomorrow night, and each night until you're out of here." Hans wanted to believe his brother, but from where he was standing, he didn't know what he could do. "I must go. I'll be back to visit you in a night or two." Lars nodded and then sneaked his way out of the stable. Hans lowered himself back onto the ground and attempted to get comfortable in his haystack. Just as he had gotten curled up, a member of the night guard poked his head into the stable. "You still in there, boy?" he asked. Hans let out a loud sigh. "Of course you are. You've got nowhere else to go." The two guards burst out laughing as they turned to continue their patrol. Hans rolled over and did his best to get at least a few hours of sleep that night. And as he finally began to drift off, Hans thought to himself, "Arendelle will be mine, or it will crumble."